All right, more answers for Quora. What are the differences? This is a very basic one, but always like to answer whatever we can. What are the differences between kosher, halal, and Buddhist vegetarian foods? I don't know if this is on account of the new laws in Illinois or other things, or for prison, or I'm not really sure. So working in prison ministry, I can give one type of answer, and as a student of theology and comparative religion and of my own faith, which is Judaism, I could answer a different way. So on a practical level, it's possible to hit all of these at once. I would say I don't know that much about Buddhist vegetarian ideas, but I know a little bit about it. So I think first I want to discuss about the differences between kosher and halal. Well, I mean, first of all, the most basic differences, we're talking about three different religions. We're talking about Judaism, Islam, and Buddhism. So that's the first point. Judaism and Islam are much more connected. Islam really comes out of both Judaism and Christianity, and has more in common with Judaism than it has with Christianity. The only really thing that it has in common with Christianity is that it does recognize Jesus as a Messiah and as a prophet, which is not on our radar. A lot of Christians ask, how do Jews look at Jesus? Kind of the answer would be, well, how do Christians look at Muhammad? And I don't mean in a negative sense that some bigoted people have. Just mean in a theological sense, it's kind of not on Christian radar, because the church fathers didn't have these interactions. The authors of the Christian books that Christians call the New Testament were all centuries before the rise of Islam. So it's just not on the radar. It's the same thing would be for us, but that's digressing. That's not part of what we're saying here. But as far as practice and theology, Judaism and Islam have much more in common. And both Christianity and Islam come out of Judaism. So between kosher and halal, kosher with most things is more strict than halal. The only thing really that is that is kosher, that is not halal, meaning that halal is more strict about, is alcohol. As far as meat is concerned, kosher meat has much more rules about what makes it kosher than what makes halal. And also it's much more strict about who can slaughter something as kosher than who can slaughter something as halal. However, still, for a Muslim, it is more ideal to have something that was slaughtered by a Muslim, but they are allowed to have something that's slaughtered if it's slaughtered in the same way as Muslims slaughtered by one of the people of the book, which are generally understood to be Jews and Christians and another group that are usually translated as Sabians, that of which scholars debate which group that would be referring to. Some say it might be something like the Druze, or there's other groups. There's one that's the Yazidi. I think the Yazidis are a little bit later than Islam. But some say it might be some other groups. But in any event, and then there are some more liberal scholars who would venture to say that if Muhammad knew about Buddha, he would say Buddha was also a prophet. But that's a very liberal approach and not really mainstream as far as I know. but again, from there I digress. So basically, all kosher meat is halal, but something that's marked halal meat almost certainly is not kosher. If it's a meat product, and it only has, pretty much for meat products, actual meat, to be kosher, they need to be marked as kosher. Meat of mammals in Jewish law can only come from hooved ungulates with split hooves. So among the domestic animals, it would basically be the various types of cows, sheep, and goats. And then among the wild animals, you have deer and antelope and giraffe, and the wild forms of the cows, buffalo, things like that, the wild goats, wild sheep. So even-toed ungulates is, but not all of them, because again, it has to be an animal that chews its cud, so that's why a pig is out, because even though it's a split hoof, it doesn't chew cud. And then you have animals that chew cud, like camels and llamas, but don't have the type of hoof that we understand to be a split hoof in Judaism to be kosher. Among birds, there are much more types of birds that are kosher, but generally we only eat birds in which we have a tradition that people eat them. And so certainly chickens, turkeys are a matter of debate, but are generally accepted today. Most ducks, although again there's debates about different types of ducks in different communities. Doves and pigeons are kosher, and many others are as well, but again, we're not used to eating a lot of these different species, so generally what you're going to see available as far as kosher birds would be, the chickens, turkeys, ducks, geese, and in some places they do slaughter pigeons and doves. Now, to be a kosher slaughter, it has to be slaughtered by a Jewish person who is trained specifically how to slaughter. And so the training cannot be out of a book. You have to receive this tradition from someone who received the tradition, and it goes all the way back to Moses. As you'd say in Hebrew, ish mipi ish, a mouth from a mouth, a man from, one person who heard it directly from another person, all the way back to Moses, and who can trace that that sort of apostolic succession, as the Catholics would call it, as far as being trained how to slaughter properly. And they have to demonstrate their piety and so forth in order to do so. And then when it comes to domestic mammals, there are certain parts of the body that we don't eat, certain fats and the sciatic nerve and so forth. The sciatic nerve is the same with domestic and wild. I don't remember offhand, but certainly the forbidden fats are only with the domestic mammals. And then there are other issues that are similarly involved with this question of the slaughter, and then all the blood has to be removed, and even after all the blood is removed, we still, before we would cook the meat, we salt it and soak it. So the same thing as we don't scald and this is the same rule with the chickens, with the birds. Mammals and birds have to have proper slaughter and all blood removed, which is generally done through after the blood is drained, and really there's not much blood left in the animal once it's drained, the way it's slaughtered. Still, nonetheless, we will salt and soak the meats before they can be really, considered kosher. And if you can't salt it, there's it's an opinion, it could be broiled also, and livers are always broiled. Fish don't need to be slaughtered in a specific way, but they do have to be a kosher fish. And so on fish there are 4 types of scales, and 2 of those types, which are the ones that are easily removed, are the types that are recognized as kosher. And so the Bible says that fish have to have scales and fins, but essentially anything that has those types of scales that are easily removed, like when you clean a fish, you take a knife and you like something to scrape off scales. Those types of scales that come off very easily are not fixed very tightly to the fish are definitely kosher. As opposed to, then there's questions of a fish like a sturgeon and so forth. Those armored scales, whether those count as scales or not, and most opinions say they are not, though there are different opinions about it. But generally, we go to the opinion that in most, certainly Orthodox circles, that the sturgeon is not a kosher fish. Although it is a matter of debate. And so when it's a debate, particularly of a biblical nature, we tend to err on the side of caution. Now, the next question we have is what's going on here? What are we doing here? Is the fact that in kosher law we don't mix meat and milk. Fish and milk would be okay, although some people have a custom to avoid that. But meat and milk, so no cheeseburgers. Although nowadays, you have the Impossible burgers, things like that are plant-based that you could eat with cheese. They also have plant-based cheese that you could put on your meat. Although there are some people who would say that has a look of sin, but generally it's understood that as long as you have, especially something that you keep the carton out, and you show you keep the wrapping out and show this is the cheese that we're using. It's not real cheese, then it's okay. Although some disagree, and so when it comes to, and so another issue is wine, and most would say this applies to grape juice as well, until it can only be made by an observant Jew, Orthodox Jew, a believer, and it cannot really, an open container or an open cup of wine, or according to most opinions, grape juice, cannot be handled by anyone else, whether a non-observant Jew or a non-Jew, until it's pasteurized. Once it's pasteurized, or even it's cooked a little bit, the different opinions how hot it has to be cooked, then it renders it unfit for sacrificial use. Although still nowadays most people use that still for sacramental use, although there are opinions that you could not use it for sacramental use. Different opinions on that question, but generally it's understood as yes, you can. What's the next questions that we have? So those are the major issues of kosher. And with that being said, is that also everything that's prepared also has to be prepared in a kosher kitchen. And since meat and milk are not mixed, you use separate dishes and separate utensils and so forth, especially the cooking utensils and cooking pans and dishes for meat and milk. And anything that has milk in it, so you see a lot of kosher items and like a cookie or something that says dairy, so then you wouldn't have that with meat. Fish you could, but not meat. You could, and you can have the milk before the meat, but after the meat we wait 6 hours in most communities. Some wait 3 hours, some wait 1 hour after the meat, but the standard today is 6 hours. So it's a lot involved. Then there are other rules that go beyond that. We are careful to make sure there's no bugs in the food, especially a lot of produce tends to be infested with insects. If there's small but visible enough to be seen with the naked eye without a microscope, or without, you don't have to look at it even with a magnifying glass, but meaning if they're noticeable with a magnifying glass but visible without it, then it would still be an issue if it's a whole bug. If it's part of a bug and it's mixed in unintentionally, and it doesn't depart any flavor, different story. But shellfish, all arthropods, with the exception of certain species of grasshoppers and locusts, are not kosher. So, certainly the large crustaceans that people like to eat are not kosher, and those do have a distinct flavor. So, that's part of the laws of kosher. The next aspect that we'd like to bring out with the kosher laws is that this is a little bit more obscure. Is that if it's a type of food that would be served at like a state dinner, a royal banquet, something, and it's not eaten raw, that an observant Jew has to be involved in the cooking process, and that everyone agrees on, although there's different opinions of how much he or she has to be involved in the cooking process. The more lenient opinion, which is the more common opinion, is that's enough even to light a pilot light. And the pilot light could be running for months and months, or even years, and then that would render some connection. That's enough. Others say the more strict opinion is that he has to actually put the food on the fire or stir the pot or something to be involved with that, as far as what is considered to be cooking by someone who's outside of the community or not. Now, in addition to that, there are two things that are generally seen as stringencies, although one is really the main law. It's just that there's opinions about how to apply it. One is when it comes to milk, whether the milking has to be supervised to ensure that the animal that's being milked is indeed a kosher animal. That they're not milking pigs and so forth. It's generally agreed that the more, I would say, common approach is that milk in America, just as milk, we know that it's cow's milk. If it just says goat's milk, we know it's goat's milk. If it just says sheep's milk, we know it says sheep's milk. So anything like a pig's milk or a camel's milk has to be marked as such. Which just plain milk has to be cow's milk, and so therefore it's kosher. Although there are different opinions about the hormones that are injected in the cows, whether they affect the cows in some way that might render them not kosher, but that's a matter of dispute and debate. The next, and so there's a stringency of only having milk that is under supervision. Meaning today in America it's considered a stringency, whereas in the older days that would have been the main law, although maybe not everyone kept it all the time. The other issue also is that baked goods baked in a private home, even if all the items are kosher, that's not an observant Jewish home, are not kosher. Commercially baked goods baked by non-Jews, as long as all the ingredients are kosher, are kosher. But it does say that on the Sabbath and the 10 days of repentance, one should be strict to have only things that were baked by a Jew. And again, if the Jew just has some involvement, turning on the oven, turning on the pilot light, makes the whole thing what we call pas Yisrael, that is baked by a Jew, by an observant Jew. It's not a racist issue, because a convert is Jewish, and the And for these laws of kosher, someone born Jewish who is not observant is not considered to be Jewish, as far as these laws are concerned. The next, and again, and that applies also to the ones that everyone agrees on, with wine and the cooking of things that cannot be eaten raw, that are fit to be served at a royal banquet. And there's all these discussions about what does that mean, So like a lot of times they'll ask you what happens in the White House, and again, it's not what the president eats personally. If a president goes and eats at McDonald's or something, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about what's served at a state dinner, or really, I think pretty much everything that's cooked in the White House, everything is fresh, nothing is frozen, nothing comes out of a can, as far as I know, things like that. And so that would therefore, still to this day, so we say once something is made, put in a can or so forth, or even anything that's served in an institutional setting, might not fall under those laws with different opinions, or even the way it's packaged and so forth. So, for example, whatever, there's many different issues, but the bigger issue that everyone agrees on is that the dishes and the equipment and so forth. And if it's not, there's ways to make it kosher, depending on what it's made out of. But if it's made out of metal, it's rather easy to make it kosher, and so forth. So we see kosher is very, very strict, much stricter than halal, which basically halal, the biggest thing for halal is not to eat pork. That's the most important thing in the laws of halal, which we have in Judaism, of course, the same thing. And culturally, you have, even many Jews who are maybe not totally observant, they don't eat pork. Not all, depends on, how religious they are and so forth. And but meaning you'll find Jewish people who don't keep kosher, but still they'll avoid pork products. And so similarly under Islam, there are some who just say the main thing is no pork, and then you could just say Bismillah over other foods. But generally they say no, you have to actually slaughter according to the Dhabicha, which is similar to what we call Zabicha in Hebrew, which means a sacrificial sense of slaughter, which we don't have in sometimes we still use the word Zbicha, but in the way we operate things, that's generally how we call chulin. The kosher meat is non-sacrificial meat, and sacrifices are only done in the temple. I know a lot of people, they discuss this whole issue of slaughtering a chicken before Yom Kippur. That's specifically not a sacrifice. That's still chulin, like we say. Next, so in Islam, though, they allow animals that are not kosher. So among the mammals, they allow camels and rabbits, which are specifically not kosher and mentioned in the Bible. Rabbits, some people disagree whether it's talking about a rabbit or a hyrax. A hyrax scientifically would make more sense because it's more closely related to the ungulate animals. It's a Afrotherium animal. that has some more connection to ungulates. It's closer related to ungulates. I believe it is considered ungulate as opposed to the lagomorphs, the rabbits. But in any event, the camel and all these animals, and like I said, the rabbit. These are not. Rabbit is definitely not kosher. Everyone agrees it's not kosher. Just whether it's specifically mentioned as something that chews cud but doesn't have hooves, which clearly rabbits don't chew cud, as opposed to the hyrax that, in a certain sense, I think does chew cud in a primitive sense, but certainly it's not hooved. The next issue also with, however, birds of prey and so forth are not halal. Lions and tigers and bears and things like that also are not halal, according to most opinions that I have seen. The next thing is the sea creatures. In Islam, all sea creatures are halal. So lobster, shellfish, they're all halal, and all types of fish. And I don't know if perhaps other creatures that live in the water, whales and dolphins and even seals, I don't know how far that exactly goes in Islam, but certainly shellfish and things like that are halal and they're not kosher. So that's another example of where kosher is much stricter than halal. And again, and all plant products are halal, which is generally the case with kosher, except things that are grown in the Holy Land, there are different rules, and if those rules are not met, there could be issues as far as what's kosher or not, but they're rather easily remedied, but not always. Now, that's pretty much the difference between kosher and halal. So most things that are vegetarian and most things that are vegan might certainly will be halal. It would probably technically be kosher as well, unless they're being prepared on non-kosher settings, and also if there are visible bugs in the vegetarian products, and also, again, even if they're very tiny but they're not microscopic, they're visible to the naked eye under some circumstance. They might be camouflaged well or something, but if they're and they're whole. And then the other issue with a vegetarian restaurant, again, a vegetarian, if the eggs or the milk come from eggs from a non-kosher bird, milk from a non-kosher animal would not be kosher. And then, the stringencies of Chalav Yisrael and Pas Yisrael and Bishul Akum, still all of those apply. Certainly if it's more like a fancy vegetarian restaurant, it's much more involved there. The next question is, so now Buddhist vegetarian. Now, my understanding is that the Buddha himself was not a vegetarian. He taught his disciples to go collecting alms. And in the alms collecting, if they received in their bowl, their beggar's bowl, beef or whatever other meat, whatever was being served, they're allowed to eat it. Certainly we know, so vegetarianism is not a requirement in Buddhism, So that's a point that should be well made. However, many Buddhists choose to be vegetarian for various reasons. Buddhism is a very different type of religion than the Abrahamic religions. The Abrahamic religions focus very much on two things, creed and deed. Christianity certainly focuses mainly on creed and less on deed. Judaism focuses maybe more on deed, but somewhat on creed, but maybe less of an emphasis on creed. Islam, I would say, is probably right in the middle. In a certain sense, deed and creed have equal footing in Islam, but the truth is the Islamic creed and the Jewish creed are very similar. Certainly, theologically speaking, the main difference would be the holy books, which books are holy, etc. But still, nonetheless, we speak of Orthodox Judaism, not merely orthoprax, meaning doctrine is important in Judaism, and in my opinion is central, although I know a lot of people disagree. However, the doctrines are very limited. Generally understood for Orthodox doctrine are the 13 principles of faith, and even that is a matter of debate. But it's clear that there's something that if you believe the wrong way, there is some point where you lose your share in heaven. That's one thing that, it's very interesting, meaning that in the Talmud it lists the people who lose their share, the Jews who lose their share in the world to come. It's almost totally talking about issues of belief, of dogma, of theology, and not of deeds. So those who say that how you act is more important than how you believe in Judaism are mistaken. However, belief is considered to be, it's not a separate category in Judaism, but rather it's part of just what you practice. And in general, the belief is expressed in our liturgy. And so the Orthodox liturgy will have the expressions of belief, particularly the more controversial beliefs. One in particular is a belief that there will eventually be a physical resurrection of the dead. And so that's what it comes up to. And in any event, Buddhism, why am I discussing that in this discussion of practice, of diet, is that Buddhism has none of that. Buddhism has really no requirements of theology or practice other than that there are I believe was the 5 Noble Truths and the 8-fold Path of Buddhism. And that walking on this path has the ultimate goal, mostly, of making someone a better person and thereby achieving a higher level and losing attachment to this world. And so the practice of vegetarianism in Buddhism might be required in certain religious societies, similar to how in Catholicism you have religious societies. So in in Buddhism, you also have these religious societies, meaning monks and nuns. And so to be an adherent of one of those communities, so then within the communal structure there are certain rules which might include vegetarianism. But again, many Buddhists see vegetarianism either as a means of being kind, meaning extending that kindness to the animal world and not killing animals for food, or it is seen as a means of detaching from the world and not having desires and attachments that lead one to suffering. That a basic idea of Buddhism is that life is suffering, and the cause of suffering is attachment. And that when one removes himself from the attachment to things of this world, he removes the suffering, and he's able to enjoy those things in this world as well, without anxiety and without attachment, without obsession. And so the question is often brought up, is Buddhism a religion or is it a philosophy? And really, essentially, there are different schools of Buddhism, some that are more, and all of them have both aspects, but there's some schools that are more religious in nature and some that are more philosophical in nature, but both have both aspects. But it's much more difficult to have a concrete answer of what Buddhist vegetarianism is all about, as opposed to within Judaism, at the very least we can say within this stream of orthodoxy there are generally these standards of kosher. This strand may be more strict approach or more lenient approach, but everyone within orthodoxy and most people within the conservative movement, which is the middle of the road, which is more liberal than the orthodox, agree to certain basic ideas of kosher, that an animal must be slaughtered properly by someone who is trained as such, and so forth, and all of the details with that. Again, I'm going to bring up in America, where you have freedom of religion and so forth, so then you'll have more liberal approaches who still might have some idea of a proper diet from a religious or ethical point and identify as Jews, but that's neither here nor there as far as what really we call kosher. There are those they talk about, they call eco-kosher, things like that. That's not what we call about a kosher diet. This term kosher is more that's a colloquialism, but we don't need to get into that. Halal also, it's rather clear. Everyone agrees, both kosher and halal. Pig is not kosher, pig is not halal, right? Everyone agrees in Orthodox Judaism, the approach to kosher food, that you don't mix meat and milk, and that all meat must be slaughtered and the blood removed, and that certain fish are not kosher and certain fish are kosher, and so forth. And then the other details is a matter of debate. And then in Islam, again, everyone agrees that the pig is not halal, and then discussion about other levels of what makes a chicken or beef and so forth halal or not. But you can point to clear legal codes in both Judaism and Islam, and legal jurisprudence within the laws of the religion. Buddhism really doesn't have that type of legalism that Judaism and Islam have. And so therefore, a Buddhist approach to vegetarianism is much more of a personal issue, as opposed to in Judaism and Islam, although it's still somewhat personal to a certain extent, especially in America where it's freedom of religion, and so you might have people that, by Orthodox standards, would be heretics, right? But they have their idea, this is what they eat, and so forth. But from the orthodoxy and the orthopraxy, you have clear books that say this is kosher, this is not, and then these are the matters of dispute. And some people are strict on this side, and some people are lenient on that side. And that is very, very clear in both Judaism and Islam. Buddhism, it's a totally different approach, and so it would generally be left to the individual practitioner to decide his or her own approach to vegetarianism. In Buddhism, whether is full vegan, and so forth. Now, there are other Eastern religions that have other rules of dietary laws. So you'll have probably the most strict are the Jains. The Jains are not only strict vegans, but the Jain religion is also, they will not eat anything that uproots an entire plant and kills the plant. So the Jain religion, which is one of the more ancient, Buddhism is a little bit newer. It's probably from about 2,800 years ago. Judaism is from about 3,300 years ago. Islam is from about 1,400 years ago, meaning the origins of these faiths. Judaism can say it's a little bit older than that, but I generally say Sinai is when Judaism began, and that the roots go back before that, but the actual religion comes from Sinai. This would be 3,300 years ago, approximately. And as far as the Jain religion, it's very ancient, probably older than Hinduism, and in many ways similar to Hinduism. But like we said, the Jain religion, so since they will not eat something that uproots a whole living thing, they won't eat potatoes or carrots or onions, any kind of root vegetable. So it's a very strict diet under Jainism. Hinduism, there's some Hindus who, like Jews, don't mix meat and milk, but they will eat meat. There are other Hindus who don't eat meat. Alan Watts generally said that Buddhism is Hinduism packaged for export, which some people could say Christianity and Islam are Judaism packaged for export. But the truth is that modern day, what we kind of call rabbinical Judaism, is also Judaism packaged for export, but it's still Judaism, and it's in many ways the original Judaism with some very minor changes to make it portable. And we say that the non-portable groups, like the Sadducees, were actually cults and heretics. But the Pharisaical approach was, as the Christian Bible attests, sit in the seat of Moses. Other religious diets, you have the what's the name of the religion? The Sikh religion, which is one of the newer religions. I think it's about 500 or 600 years old, if I'm not mistaken. And in many ways very reactionary against Islam and Hinduism. Some people say it started as an interfaith society of Muslims and Hindus, and formed an ideology that essentially eschews the things that separate these groups, but then later in history, it started similar to Buddhism as sort of an anti-religion, and then developed into a religion. Later, a few hundred years later, and so therefore, in Sikhism, you're not allowed to eat meats that were slaughtered in a traditional way or a sacrificial way. So halal meats are prohibited in Sikhism, as would also be kosher meats, most probably. And so then they have a way of slaughtering that's totally different than the kosher or halal method as well, kind of to make the point that it's not, I think it's like more strangulation as opposed to the way Judaism and Islam, we slit the throat, and it has to be a very sharp knife that it's so sharp that you feel any pain, and that cut would cut the esophagus and the trachea in one movement, without pushing too much, just a very easy cut. It's a very sharp knife, and that is how both Judaism and Islam slaughter. And the Sikh method of slaughter is different then. In the Sikh temples, however, even though Sikhism does not preach vegetarianism, they only serve vegetarian foods within their temple, so everybody is welcome. So those are essentially the various religious diets that I can think of off the top of my head. The different religions practice, although there are other traditions as well, and then there's some Christians who keep kosher, particularly Pentecostal Christians, or Seventh-day Adventists, or if they don't keep kosher, they keep something similar to kosher. Alright, thank you for watching. God bless. Please like, share, and subscribe, comment. We'll see you later. How do I turn this thing off?